When a newly widowed woman unlocks a long-sealed drawer in her late husband's desk and discovers a decades-old letter with her name on it, she thinks it might be a mundane relic of his past. But as she reads, one cryptic sentence leaps out and shatters everything she believed about their 50 years of marriage, sending her on a journey of hidden identities, unspoken secrets, and an unexpected bond with the daughter he left behind. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you believe in the power of truth coming to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Margaret Whitlow always believed her life was a straightforward picture of contentment. She lived in a cozy home in upstate New York, surrounded by quiet neighbors, well-kept yards, and the sense of modest routine that came with retirement. She had spent 5 decades alongside her husband, Arthur, a man whose voice never rose in anger, whose manner was steadfastly gentle, and whose daily habits rarely altered. Mornings brought them shared coffee at the kitchen table. Afternoons might find them browsing an antique store or working a jigsaw puzzle, and evenings were spent with jazz humming softly in the living room. They had grown old together in a calm, unremarkable way. In early April, when Arthur passed in his sleep, the hush of that morning matched the numb sorrow Margaret felt. She had gone to wake him, only to find his chest no longer rose and fell. The paramedics arrived, voices subdued, confirming what she already knew. The funeral followed 2 days later. It was gray out, a sky that threatened rain but never delivered, leaving the air heavy with unshed tears. Friends and family gathered, whispering that if one had to picture a perfect couple, Margaret and Arthur would have been it. Stable, loving, never embroiled in messy drama, never even raising their voices. Margaret buried him on a cold morning that felt too still for grief. She stood by the graveside, her coat buttoned tight, the breeze ruffling the edges of the black ribbon in her hair. Her son, Daniel, stood at her side, gently squeezing her hand. She offered the standard pleasantries to guests, receiving murmured condolences and kind remarks about Arthur's gentle spirit. Then, when everyone else left, she stayed by the headstone for an extra minute, trying to absorb the reality of a world without him. Even in sorrow, she had no reason to suspect that anything about her life with Arthur was amiss. Returning home to the empty house, she set about the quiet process of sorting his things. She found old sweaters tucked in the back of the closet, decades of tax records in carefully labeled boxes, and countless crossword puzzles stacked on his writing desk. Most of it felt comforting, a routine part of settling affairs. She even smiled at the crossword books, recalling the evenings he'd spent puzzling over them by lamplight. Now she would have to donate or recycle them. Then she noticed the desk's lower drawer, the one with a tiny lock that Arthur always insisted was just for tax stuff, or so he said. In nearly 50 years of marriage, she had never opened it, trusting that it contained nothing more than old receipts. The key lay in a shallow dish on the top of the desk. She turned it in the lock with a small click and drew the drawer open. She saw a single envelope, yellowed with age, stamped with a faint watermark she recognized as something official. The address was not to Arthur, but to her, to Margaret Elaine Whitlow, née Reeves. If I don't come back. Her heart thudded. The date at the top read March 1973, which made no sense to her. That was 2 months before she and Arthur had met, or at least before the day she recalled meeting him. Curiosity warred with a strange sense of dread. She told herself it might be a harmless curiosity, some old letter that ended up in the wrong drawer. But her name was right there, in a careful script, as if anticipating a future that had yet to unfold. She carefully slipped the letter from its envelope, noticing a faint State Department header, as though it came from some official channel. She read the words, "If this reaches you, it means I'm either dead or no longer who I was. I want to explain why you might be hearing my name, why someone may one day come looking for me. You were chosen, but I chose you too. I needed a clean life, a real one, something that couldn't be touched. I've buried Anna and Sophie, not because I stopped loving them, but because it was the only way to keep them alive. They told me you'd never know, that you'd be safe. But if you're reading this, I guess it caught up to us." Her body froze, the letter trembling in her hands. Who were Anna and Sophie? What did it mean that she had been chosen? And how could Arthur have written this before they ever met? His name didn't appear on the page, but the implication was clear. The letter writer mentioned the possibility of death or being someone else entirely. She felt a chill, as though her entire sense of normalcy had suddenly shattered. She slid the letter back into the envelope, her pulse pounding, and tried to catch her breath. The next morning, she called Daniel, who lived in Washington, D.C. He worked at the National Archives, specializing in digitizing old documents and cross-referencing restricted files. Margaret told him she had found something disturbing, but not the details over the phone. He booked a flight and arrived the following morning, carrying his laptop and an intense look of concern. In the living room, over cups of tea, she showed him the letter. She had read it so many times by then, the words echoing in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Daniel read it twice, brow furrowed. When he looked up, Margaret saw confusion in his eyes. "Mom, do you have any idea what all this means?" She shook her head. "Arthur always said that drawer was for tax records. I never questioned it." Daniel glanced at the letter again. If he wrote this, it sounds like he expected something from his past to catch up with him. Or maybe that he had a different identity. The word identity sent a jolt through Margaret's chest, as though the letter's mention of no longer who I was might be literal. She stammered. "He never told me anything like that. I had no reason to suspect." Daniel pulled out his laptop and began typing feverishly. He explained that he had access to certain archival databases that an ordinary person wouldn't. Nothing top secret, but enough to see if Arthur was flagged or if the letter's references matched any old government documents. Margaret hovered behind him as he typed, pulling up search queries, scanning for the name Arthur Whitlow. The databases turned up nothing remarkable. Then Daniel tried Arthur's old birth date. Again, nothing. It was as if no official records existed for a man by that name prior to 1973. Other than standard issue forms like Social Security and a driver's license that apparently started the year Margaret had met him. Margaret found herself shaking. She pressed her palm against the back of Daniel's chair to steady herself. "Try searching me," she whispered. Daniel shot her a puzzled look, but he obeyed, typing Margaret Elaine Reeves. Then her date of birth, her place of origin. The query returned a single strange reference in a partial CIA index. Margaret Elaine Reeves, civilian alias, protection cover. Linked to asset Whitfield A. Vienna Station, terminated 1973. Daniel's mouth dropped open. Margaret stared at the screen, uncomprehending. She had never left the country, never had dealings with the CIA, and yet there was her name, linked to something about a protection cover. "That can't be right," Daniel muttered. "Maybe it's a mistake or someone else with your name." But the data matched her birth date, her background, her exact details. Margaret felt her stomach twist. "This says I was part of some operation, but I would remember." She set a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Daniel, what does it mean?" He exhaled slowly. "It might mean that you were unwittingly used as a cover identity for someone else, or that someone set up your background to help them hide. If Dad wasn't Dad, maybe he created a new life in 1973, and your name was flagged as part of it." Margaret's head swam. She realized the entire foundation of her marriage might have been built on a deception. How could Arthur have done such a thing? She recalled all those quiet nights by the fireplace, all the gentle laughter they shared. It was impossible to reconcile that tenderness with the notion of covert identities and intelligence operations. She had no idea how any of it connected to the letter mentioning Anna and Sophie, or what burying them could mean. She managed to say only, "I want to know everything. I need to know." In the days that followed, Daniel threw himself into deeper research. He filed official requests for partial FOIA disclosures, though they might take time. He also rummaged through the National Archives' hush-hush corners, searching for references to an Andrew Whitfield, suspecting that the mention of Whitfield A. was a clue. Margaret spent long hours pacing the living room, ignoring phone calls from well-meaning friends who wanted to check on her after Arthur's funeral. She felt numb to sympathy from acquaintances. Instead, she wanted answers. Late one evening, Daniel tapped away at his laptop while Margaret sat on the couch, the letter from Arthur clenched in her hand. Suddenly, Daniel let out a triumphant noise. "Mom, come see this." She rushed over. On the screen was a partially redacted PDF, seemingly a declassified CIA memo from the early 1970s. The relevant portion read, "Subject Andrew Whitfield, recruited at age 23, specialized in Eastern Bloc infiltration, deployed under diplomatic cover to Budapest. Relationship established with Hungarian national Anna Galaxy, resulting in one child, Sophie. Operation compromised in 1972. Extraction initiated. Civilian assets left behind." Margaret's knees almost gave out. She sank onto the arm of the chair. Her heart hammered. So Arthur had once been Andrew Whitfield, an American intelligence officer in Hungary, who fathered a child named Sophie with a Hungarian woman named Anna. The timeline was impossible to miss. If that child was born in, say, 1970 or 1971, Sophie would have been about 2 or 3 when the operation collapsed in 1972. So what became of them? The memo stated that Anna and Sophie were left behind. Daniel scrolled further. Another snippet read, "New identity arrangement for A. Whitfield. Arthur James Whitlow, upstate New York, established post-exfiltration. Civilian spouse targeted for cover. Margaret Reeves, verified no political affiliations, low risk. Implementation date 1973. Margaret's breath came in gasps, tears pricking her eyes. The words hammered into her. Civilian spouse targeted for cover. So their entire courtship, their marriage, might have been orchestrated. The man she knew as Arthur, newly arrived in the area, had set himself up with a job at a local consulting firm. He had approached her in a small bookstore where they first met, or so she had always believed. Now it seemed possible that he had known about her in advance, that he'd chosen her because she fit the profile. She stood abruptly, her mind seething with confusion and betrayal. Every memory of their wedding day, the way he gazed at her in that white gown, his vow that he loved her, all of it might have been some twisted version of the truth. Daniel tried to comfort her, but she brushed off his hand, not angrily, but out of raw shock. She muttered, "I can't believe this. Was any of it real?" Daniel insisted that maybe Arthur had truly loved her, that maybe the arrangement started as a cover but became genuine over time. Margaret was too distraught to consider that. She recalled the letter's words, "You were chosen, but I chose you too." She wanted to interpret it as a sincere affection, but the pain overshadowed her hope. She felt used, as though her entire adult life was built on a foundation of secrets. The next morning, Daniel found more documents referencing Anna and Sophie. He discovered a lead that Sophie had immigrated to the United States in 1989, after the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. A small note in the immigration file indicated she had tried to contact a Mr. Arthur Whitlow, but the letter was returned as undeliverable. That implied Sophie had tried to reach her father. Yet Margaret knew nothing about it. She wondered if Arthur had known but concealed it, or if the letter truly never reached him. Margaret sat at the dining table, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Daniel softly explained the significance. "It looks like Sophie came here alone, no next of kin on file. She was in her mid to late teens by then. She must have believed her father was still alive, or at least reachable." Margaret swallowed against the dryness in her throat. So she tried, but someone blocked her. She stared at the letter from Arthur's drawer, her mind replaying those lines about how he'd buried Anna and Sophie for their own protection. Had the system that built his new identity also prevented him from reuniting with them? In the days that followed, Margaret wrestled with indecision. On one hand, she felt fury and heartbreak toward the man she'd spent 50 years with. On the other hand, she found herself mourning not just for him, but for Anna and Sophie, who had apparently been abandoned behind the Iron Curtain. Did they think he had simply walked away without caring? The tragedy of it gnawed at Margaret's heart. She realized that her entire marriage might have been part of his attempt to remain hidden from enemies or keep his old family safer by cutting ties. That possibility left her teetering between devastation and reluctant sympathy. Late one afternoon, she decided to write a letter to Sophie. She found an address in the immigration file that Daniel uncovered. It was old, referencing an apartment in Pennsylvania. She didn't know if Sophie still lived there, but she had to try. She composed her words carefully, introducing herself as Margaret Whitlow, widow of Arthur. She explained that she had only just discovered that he was once Andrew Whitfield, and that he had a past family in Hungary. She wrote with trembling honesty, "I believe he may have been your father. I didn't know. I only learned this now after he passed. If you're still at this address, please respond. I don't know all the answers, but I want to understand." She mailed it, feeling her heart thud as she dropped the envelope into the postbox. Then began the agonizing wait. Every day, she checked the mail with a blend of dread and hope. What if Sophie was furious and wanted nothing to do with her? What if Sophie had died? What if the letter never reached her? Margaret's nights became sleepless, haunted by mental images of a Hungarian woman and her little girl, waiting for Arthur to return, only to face heartbreak. She'd toss and turn, hearing the memory of Arthur's gentle voice in her ear, wondering how he could have kept such monumental secrets from her. 3 weeks later, a plain envelope arrived, the postmark from Pittsburgh. Margaret's pulse raced as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with neatly typed text. "He was a ghost. I thought he'd abandoned us. I never knew he tried to come back. If you're willing to meet, I think we both deserve the truth." It was signed, simply, Sophie. Margaret pressed the paper to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had half expected an angry tirade or an outright dismissal. But Sophie's words were measured, giving her the impression of someone who, despite long-nurtured bitterness, still wanted answers. Margaret hesitated to involve Daniel, fearing that he might overcomplicate things or insist on coming along. She felt a need to face Sophie alone, to see the face of Arthur's daughter and let that reality sink in. So she quietly planned a trip, telling Daniel only that she needed to drive out of town for a few days to clear her head. She took a slow, thoughtful drive to Pittsburgh. The highway stretched beneath a mix of sun and cloud, the horizon shifting from farmland to suburban sprawl. She had plenty of time to reflect, to steel herself for what this meeting would be. She replayed her earlier visits with Arthur's grave, how she'd stood there in tears, uncertain whether to feel anger or sorrow. That confusion lingered, but she felt she owed it to Sophie, and maybe to Anna, wherever she was or if she'd passed on by now, to unravel the rest of the story. She arrived in the city by late afternoon, checking into a modest hotel near the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. They had agreed to meet on a bench near the museum grounds, a public place that felt safe for both of them. Margaret had no idea what to expect. Would Sophie be suspicious, resentful, or cold? Or would she be just as scared and confused as Margaret? The next morning, Margaret walked to the designated spot, her stomach in knots. She recognized Sophie immediately. She was in her 50s, just as Margaret had surmised, with carefully pinned hair and a bearing that looked both poised and guarded. She stood when Margaret approached, the two women studying each other. Margaret offered a tentative smile, while Sophie's eyes flickered with some emotion Margaret couldn't quite name. They shook hands, an odd formality for two people connected in such a strange, personal way. They sat on the bench, the sounds of passing traffic muffled by the trees around them. For a while, neither spoke. Margaret felt a lump in her throat, recalling how Arthur or Andrew might have cradled this woman in his arms as a toddler. She imagined the heartbreak Sophie endured, growing up fatherless in a country under harsh political pressure. She finally broke the silence, voice trembling. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure you would." Sophie nodded, her gaze drifting away. "I wasn't sure either, but I wanted to know if he really was my father. And if so, why he never came back." Margaret explained everything she knew, from the hidden drawer to the letter's revelations, from the files Daniel uncovered to her own sense of betrayal. She spoke carefully, wanting to convey the truth without feeding Sophie false hope. She admitted, "I never suspected a thing. He was so normal, warm. We raised our son, Daniel. We had a simple life. I I never questioned it. Her voice wavered. If I had known, I would have done something. Maybe tried to help him find you. Sophie's expression softened slightly, though her jaw remained set. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in old silk. She handed it to Margaret with a trembling hand. My mother kept this, she said quietly. It's the only photo we had of all three of us. Margaret unwrapped it, revealing a black and white photograph of a younger Arthur, hair shorter and parted differently, standing beside a woman with delicate features who clutched a toddler in her arms. Margaret recognized Arthur's smile, though it had a trace of tension, as if he were caught between happiness and worry. Margaret's tears came unbidden, blurring her vision. She carefully traced a fingertip over the photo. That's Anna? She asked. Sophie nodded. She died when I was in my 20s. Cancer. She never remarried. She carried a burden all her life, always telling me to be careful what I said, who I trusted. The secret police questioned her for months after my father disappeared. She lost her job. We struggled, but we survived. Her voice wavered with an old pain. I always believed he had abandoned us, that maybe he was just a selfish man who didn't care. Margaret's heart constricted. She recalled the letter's mention of how he had to bury Anna and Sophie to keep them alive, suggesting that if he maintained contact, it might put them in danger. She wondered how Anna had felt in the aftermath, alone, possibly under surveillance, believing herself forsaken. It all felt so horribly unfair, like a tragedy orchestrated by forces bigger than any of them. Margaret said, "He wrote that he left you to save you from some threat. He never told me, but the letter suggests it was a matter of life or death." Sophie exhaled, tears welling up. "If that's true, I wish we'd known." The not knowing was the worst. They sat in silence, broken only by the distant rumble of a bus passing. Margaret felt the weight of the secrets pressing down on them. Then Sophie reached back into her purse, producing a crumpled envelope. "This arrived last year, from no return address. I didn't know what to make of it. It was just a short note in shaky handwriting. I realized it wasn't really for me. It mentioned your name. I couldn't understand the context, so I kept it. I wondered if I'd ever find you, or if you even existed." Margaret took the envelope with trembling fingers. She saw the date scrawled in the corner, only a month before Arthur died. The letter inside was on a single sheet of lined paper, words penned in a familiar hand, though slightly unsteady, as though Arthur had been ill or trembling when he wrote it. She read, "Margaret, I didn't deserve the life we built. You weren't just a cover. You saved me. You gave me peace after war. I wish I could have told you everything, but I was always afraid the past would hurt you. I left Anna and Sophie to save them. But you saved me back. Please forgive the man I used to be. And thank you for letting me become someone better." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She read the paragraph again and again, absorbing his confession. Arthur had, in his final days, tried to put his regrets into words and at least give her some measure of closure. She felt an ache so profound it almost took her breath away. She extended the note toward Sophie, her hand shaking. Sophie let out a shaky breath. "So he did think of us," she murmured. "He was always watching from the shadows, maybe, or he wanted to. I wish I knew." They lingered there on the bench for a long time, quietly sharing the grief neither had realized they would one day face together. Margaret's mind churned with 100 questions that had no easy answers, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. At least some part of Arthur's affection had been real. He had never intended for them to remain ignorant forever, but his fear had kept him silent. She recalled the phrase, "I was always afraid the past would hurt you," and realized that maybe his manipulations, as cruel as they seemed, were rooted in a desire to protect them all. Finally, Sophie sniffled and said, "He died in comfort, with a wife who cared for him, yes?" Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, he did." Sophie's shoulders slumped, as though she was releasing the last of her resentment. "Then that's enough for me to start forgiving." Margaret carefully placed a hand on Sophie's. They exchanged a glance that spoke of shared loss. The father that Sophie knew so briefly, and the husband Margaret had loved for half a century, had been the same man, yet neither woman had known the full truth of him. Over the next hour, they talked more, discussing minor details of their lives. Sophie told stories about her mother's resilience, the hardships of growing up in Budapest, and her eventual escape to the U.S. after the political climate shifted. Margaret talked about how Arthur always woke early to read the newspaper, how he adored jazz, how he taught Daniel to ride a bike. They found themselves laughing softly at certain recollections, like how he insisted on adding a dash of hot sauce to almost every meal, or how he'd hum a tune while raking leaves. It felt surreal, each woman painting a corner of a portrait of a man who had kept them partitioned from one another. Margaret realized she had not fully told Daniel about this trip or about receiving Sophie's reply. She resolved to share it all with him once she returned. She imagined Daniel's shock, but also his relief that the mysteries were coming together. For now, she and Sophie decided that they would each try to find any remaining documents, photos, or memories that might help piece together a broader story. Sophie mentioned that she had an old suitcase of her mother's, stored in a closet, filled with personal items from Hungary. Perhaps it contained clues as to how Anna truly felt during those tumultuous years. Margaret offered to do the same with any diaries or letters left behind in Arthur's belongings. They parted with an embrace that felt tentative but genuine. Margaret returned to her hotel, heart raw yet somehow lighter. This journey was not just about unveiling Arthur's secrets. It was also about forging a new connection with Sophie, the daughter who had been left behind. Margaret felt that in doing so, she might honor both Anna's suffering and Arthur's final wish that no one be harmed by his past. She drove home the next day, letting Daniel know that she had some answers. Once back, she told him about Sophie, the meeting, and the letter addressed to her by Arthur. Daniel listened with wide eyes, alternating between shock and a poignant sadness. He hugged his mother, apologizing that he had never suspected such a labyrinth in their family history. She told him there was no need for apologies. They were all victims of a system that had valued secrecy above human ties. In the following weeks, Margaret found that living with the knowledge of Arthur's spy past was disorienting. She looked around the house, noticing small items that might have carried hidden significance. His old station on the radio, could it have been set to pick up coded broadcasts, or was that paranoia? She found letters he'd written to her over the years, each one affectionate and ordinary. She half expected to see codes hidden among them. But no, they were simply notes from a loving husband. "Marge, don't forget to pick up eggs," or "wish me luck at my checkup." She concluded that if he had once been Andrew Whitfield, the seasoned intelligence operative, he had deeply embraced life as Arthur Whitlow, the gentleman in upstate New York. Amid that swirl of discovery, Margaret decided to plan a small gesture. The summary of revelations had ended, but she felt drawn to do something tangible to acknowledge Anna and Sophie. She arranged for a plaque at Arthur's grave, wanting to add a line that recognized his complicated truth. She asked the local monument engraver for help in creating a new line on the headstone, something that indicated he was more than just a husband. At first, she struggled with how much to say, but eventually settled on a father, a husband, and a man who never stopped trying to protect the ones he loved. A few months passed in a haze of sorting out Arthur's estate, tying up legalities, and adjusting to widowhood. Margaret corresponded with Sophie by letters and occasional phone calls. The more they spoke, the more Margaret saw glimpses of Arthur's mannerisms in her, especially in how carefully she chose her words. Sophie had grown up facing suspicion and betrayal in her homeland, so she carried a natural reserve, but beneath it was a yearning for family. Margaret felt something akin to maternal warmth, though she knew it wasn't her place to claim a motherly role. Rather, they were two women bound by a shared love for a man they each knew in incomplete ways. Finally, one day that summer, Sophie agreed to drive from Pittsburgh to upstate New York so they could visit Arthur's grave together. Margaret felt a knot of anxious anticipation in her chest. She wondered if Sophie would cry, if she would be angry, or if she would find closure. The day dawned bright and mild, with a gentle breeze stirring the leaves. Margaret arrived at the cemetery first, wearing a modest summer dress, the new plaque polished and set at the base of the headstone. The old headstone simply read his name, dates, and beloved husband, father. But now the plaque added a new dimension of meaning. Sophie arrived, stepping out of a modest sedan. She had a single rose in her hand, wearing a simple blouse and slacks. They greeted each other with a quiet hug. Then they approached the grave, where Arthur's name was etched clearly in the stone. The grass around it was tidy, the cemetery overall peaceful. Margaret pointed to the small plaque and let Sophie read it in silence. She watched Sophie's eyes moisten, but a hint of a smile tugged at her lips. Perhaps she appreciated that no matter what darkness existed in the past, he had truly tried to protect them, even if he had gone about it in a flawed way. They stood for a long moment, letting the wind carry the hush of the place around them. Sophie gently placed the rose on the ground by the headstone. Margaret then handed her a framed photograph. Sophie took it and saw that it was the picture of Arthur, Anna, and Sophie as a child, carefully copied and placed in a modest wooden frame. Margaret said softly, "I thought it deserved to be here with him, at least for a moment. The family he left behind, and the one he found afterward, they're both real." Sophie's throat worked. She gave a small nod, then laid the framed photo beside the rose. A hush fell over them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Felt like a kind of shared acceptance. Margaret brushed away a tear and placed a gentle hand over Sophie's. In that gesture, they acknowledged the pain, the secrets, and the love that threaded them together. There would be no more hidden truths or illusions. They each had lost something, but they also had found an unexpected connection. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.